Hey everyone, I hope all is good. Please excuse the lawnmower in the background. We've actually just recently had floods here in Auckland and finally we have had a bit of sunshine, so I guess people are out mowing their lawns because everything is now growing like crazy. It's definitely not a brown, dry summer. Today I wanted to cover the pandemic of loneliness, if you will. I don't know about you, but over the Christmas break, I found myself, like my family found themselves, a lot more lonely than what we may have experienced in either previous years or when I was a kid. Anecdotally, things have seemed to change, like this world isn't one that I grew up in, obviously, but more so with how we relate to one another in society. The way that we communicate seems to be a lot different as well. I've especially noticed this post-pandemic and through the use of internet, like social media, for example. Ever since we've had cell phones, the way that we communicate has definitely evolved and changed over time. So today I just want to cover those different aspects, and I want to know if you've noticed a difference too. Now you could just be thinking, Lex, you're the one with the problem actually. You are the introverted loner and you put yourself into that position. You could be 100% correct there. In fact, yeah, you are. However, statistically, it's not just a me problem. NBC says that Americans are the most loneliest that they ever have been, especially in amongst Gen Z. 20,000 people participated in a new nationwide survey published by Cigna. Americans are lonelier than ever, with almost 50 of those surveyed feeling left out or lonely. Using the UCLA loneliness scale to compile scores, those who scored above a 43 were officially lonely on a scale of 20 to 80. An astonishing 43% Americans sometimes or always feel that their relationships are not meaningful and that they are isolated from others, and 27% of Americans rarely or never feel as though there are people who really understand them. What this comes down to is that we as a society are experiencing a lack of connection, says Douglas Nemec, MD, Chief Medical Officer for Behavioural Health at Cigna. Most alarmingly, loneliness scores rose amongst the generations, with the youngest generation, Gen Z, born between the mid-1990s and the early 2000s, scoring a 48.3 overall, as opposed to millennials who scored a 45.3, Gen X who scored an also dismal 45.1, and baby boomers who scored a 42.4. Those of grandparenting or great-grandparenting age, the greatest generation, were the least lonely with a score of 38.6. I think what I find most interesting about that survey in terms of the generations is that you would think that the eldest generation would probably be the most lonely. You know, they're losing their friends, they may be in a rest home, they've lost their lifelong husband or wife. My mum works in a hospital for the elderly and she often says how lonely they are, but according to that survey, it's actually Gen Z that are the most lonely, which I find interesting, but then it also makes sense because of what I'm going to be talking about in this video. Another thing that I find interesting is where it talks about the lack of connection, the lack of meaningful relationships. You can hang around a lot of people, but it doesn't mean to say that you're going to feel less alone if you don't have a deep and meaningful connection with others, connections that are beneath the surface. So these really are the two main things that I do want to cover today. Let's start by looking at the pandemic, because this was, you could say, a widespread social experiment on how human beings react when they are isolated from outside society and even their primary relationships. Most people did experience hardship through the lockdowns and the restrictions. Obviously, we couldn't really go out and mingle and do our jobs properly. We were all out of routine. That has a lot to do with it. But there was also the other aspect of the lack of social connection with others through the use of wearing masks and the virtual connection, being online and talking to others online. It's not as though we could pop down to grandma's and have a cup of tea with her and see her smile and engage with the both emotional and spiritual aspects of the communication. There is something about using our sixth senses when we are interacting with others, especially those who we have a deep connection with, being able to touch them, hug them, being able to see them smile, being able to hear their voice. There is a reason why in our early childhood we absolutely need to establish those social connections in order for us to establish ourselves as functioning adults. This is part of the reason why when you give birth, the doctor will put you skin to skin with your baby, because it really solidifies that connection. It releases oxytocin, it gets milk flowing. So on a physiological scale, those social connections are so important, not just with human beings either, but with animals as well. Even through the pandemic, zoo animals suffered due to loneliness.
It's kind of sad to see him missing what he loves the most. We can see them showing a huge amount of interest if they see any human. These guys are used to having, on a normal year, well over 1 million people coming to look at them, and for us to take that away from them through lockdown is not normal.
Many animals are almost fully reliant on their social groups, like gorillas, lions, dolphins, penguins. You'll find that many of them suffer when they don't have any companions around them. And this is especially true within human beings, who can absolutely suffer many health consequences if they are lonely. Social isolation significantly increases a person's risk of premature death from all causes, a risk that may rival those of smoking, obesity, and physical activity. Social isolation was associated with about 50% increased risk of dementia. Poor social relationships was associated with 29% increased risk of heart disease and 32% increased risk of a stroke. Loneliness was associated with higher rates of depression, anxiety, and suicide. The pandemic was absolutely responsible for us being physically isolated from others, and it had led to really bad health outcomes. Children are less likely to be able to read facial expressions and pick up on social cues due to mask use. The rate of alcoholism had increased during the pandemic, as well as suicide and calls to health lines. And I'm just generalizing here because obviously I live in New Zealand and every country has their own unique statistics there. And interestingly enough, we decided that the answer to this problem was obviously to use our devices, because it's right there and it's a way for us to communicate with others. It is amazing that we can actually connect with someone from the other side of the world in an instant, and in that sense we can form meaningful connections, but it does miss that element of actually being in a room with them or in an environment with them where you are able to use all of your senses, where you're able to connect on such deeper levels. But we have been using devices since like 2010 for these things, and in some cases the use of social media has replaced our immediate connection with people in our communities. Obviously, cell phones are addictive because of instant gratification and dopamine, but many of us do use social media as more of a crutch when we do have a lack of social connections in our immediate community. Whether cell phone use is either a result of declining connection with our community or the declining community as a result of cell phone use. And this is why Gen Z may be suffering the most out of all the other generations, because of that cell phone use. They're online all the time. They're not engaging all that much in society as the previous generations did. They're not even partying or having sex as much as the other generations. And while, yeah, it's a great thing that alcohol usage has gone down in Gen Z, maybe that's just a result of the fact that they're not actually getting out there and socializing. Social media has become the town square of the way that we primarily communicate as a wider society. You can't really run a business anymore without having access to the internet, at least. That's something I personally don't like, but you know what, I'm a little bit of a traditionalist in that sense, and I'm very skeptical of AI. I just don't like the idea that AI will probably replace many of our jobs, and sometimes within good reason, like very dangerous jobs. That makes sense. But obviously corporations will incorporate AI to reduce their costs. As a result, that means human beings aren't going to be interacting with each other as well when they're out and about in their communities, at least in the sense of the everyday routine-based rat race. However, I believe that this is probably not going to be a good thing for we human beings. I don't think it's going to encourage us to become more social with one another. In fact, I think it's going to do the opposite, especially with the likes of the metaverse becoming a thing and more time spent online than ever before. Machines can't replace the connection that human beings have with one another. It will always be the warmth of a real life human, the touch, the sound, and the overall spirit of that person that is what really solidifies those connections. The use of social media has cheapened our relationships. It's made them very superficial. We're in the age of instant gratification, and we're also seeing that relationships are becoming this way as well. I also think that people have become a lot more self-centered, a lot more self-focused, rather than looking to see who they can help or what they can do in their society to make it better. It's interesting during the floods that have happened in Auckland, New Zealand, that the communities tend to come together. I notice that people become a lot more friendlier with each other. They become far more giving, far less selfish, and almost as though the pride of being a Kiwi tends to increase. It's interesting that during a crisis, those things tend to happen, as though the crisis brings in a role that everybody can play in each other's lives. We can provide something of goodness to others and to the wider community, and that gives us a sense of purpose and deeper connection. But when you spend every day online, you're not forming those connections with each other, and this becomes your everyday routine. Of course, your relationships are going to become cheapened, and you're not going to be able to find purpose within your relationships. Purpose, meaning, giving, selflessness is what gives us the reason to connect with other people. And on the contrary, selfishness, self-centeredness, and lack of concern is what disconnects us from our relationships and from the community. The last 3 years have taught me so much in terms of, let's just say, having a lot more control from government, centralized control, having bills pass through Parliament like the Digital ID Framework, Therapeutics Bill, and all that. It got me thinking about how our connection with one another and our communities is so important. Without it, we are lost. Without it, we're weakened. Anyway, you guys, I hope you have a good day, night, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world, and I'll see you guys all again for the next video. Bye!